Okay, I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone back to this second session in this shamatha program based on observing the mind. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this session this evening. So this second session will be doing a variation of observing the thoughts practice we did on Monday. So this is observing emotions, but it's more or less the same practice, and we'll look at the differences there a little bit later. So this is part of this 6-session program. So this week we're looking at this practice of observing thoughts. Next week, we'll be looking at the resting and awareness practice. So also the nature of the mind is a variation of that. And then in the third week, we'll be looking at this stillness in motion practice, which is combining the two practices from this week and next week. And open awareness is a variation of that as well. Again, the recommended reading for this program is the Attention Revolution from Alan Wallace. So in this evening's session, we'll begin with a meditation, observing thoughts. So the same meditation we did as on Monday. Then following that, a little review of some of the points from the Monday session. Then we'll look at the stages of progress that we go through in this practice of observing thoughts. Some tips for the practice. Then we'll look at the actual practice, which is observing emotions. We'll do a guided meditation on that. Time for some question answer, and finish with a dedication. So the meditation that we're going to do, just to refresh your memory, observing thoughts. So what we are observing here in this shamatha practice is the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. So remember here, when we use the word thought, thought is a generic term which really means conceptual activity. So it includes emotions, memories, mental images, and so forth. So we're observing all mental conceptual activity. Means that in this practice, we're not observing sense objects. So we're not paying attention to sensations in the body, to visual objects, to sounds, and so forth. And we saw there that it's very much recommended to have the eyes open, either naturally or partially open. And we'll look at the benefits of that again a little bit later in this session. And then the quintessential instructions for this practice was without distraction and without grasping, meaning not allowing yourself to get caught up in any distractions and not grasping onto any mental events either. So just to refresh what that means, I'd like to read a little bit from Attention Revolution on page 83. And Alan Wallace says the following. He says, the object of mindfulness in the practice of settling the mind in its natural state, which is the name he gives to this practice of observing thoughts, is no longer the sensations of the breath, but the space of the mind and whatever events arise in that space. The object of introspection, as in the earlier practice of mindfulness of breathing, is the quality of the attention with which you're observing the mind. And now he quotes a meditation text which says, at the beginning, have many daily sessions, each of them of brief duration, and focus well in each one. Whenever you meditate, bear in mind the phrase, without distraction and without grasping, and put this into practice. So now Alan Wallace is commenting on that. He says, as you venture into this practice, I would encourage you to memorize these quintessential instructions, which are settle your mind without distraction and without grasping. Practicing without distraction means not allowing your mind to be carried away by thoughts and sense impressions. Be present here and now, and when thoughts arise pertaining to the past or future, or ruminations about the present, don't be abducted by them. As you hike on this trail of shamatha, don't be a hitchhiker catching a ride with any of the thoughts or images that whiz through your mind. Rather, be like a kestrel hovering motionlessly as it faces the wind, slightly moving its wings and tail feathers to adjust to changes in the currents of the air. Even when your attention is settled in the present, you may still grasp onto the appearances to the mind. Whenever you prefer one mental object over another, whenever you try to control the contents of your mind, and whenever you identify with anything at all, grasping has set in. Here is the challenge at hand. Be attentive to everything that comes up in the mind, but don't grasp onto anything. In this practice, let your mind be like the sky. Whatever moves through it, the sky never reacts. It doesn't stop anything from moving through it. It doesn't hold on to anything that's present, nor does it control anything. The sky doesn't prefer rainbows to clouds, butterflies to jet planes. Whatever comes up in the field of awareness, without distraction or grasping, just let it be. So that's the practice we're going to do. And the two imbalances, of course, distraction, excitation, distraction, and dullness or laxity. And here we can add a little bit something extra to help us if we notice any excitation or distraction. That is to lower the gaze a little bit. If you notice any agitation, lower the gaze. Or if you're finding you're sinking into dullness, then elevate the gaze and to help uplift the mind. And then the normal instructions of relax, release, return, and then refresh, restore, retain, as we saw in the last session. And here also, if you find that you are constantly becoming distracted, just constantly swept away by thoughts and so forth, then experiment with labeling or noting thoughts. So that is, give a name to the mental event. That way we can have some space from it. And in terms of labeling or noting, just name the event itself. Don't label the contents. So if you're getting frustrated about something, don't think or don't label frustration about this, because you'll just get caught up. Rather, just go frustration, image, memory, thought. Don't label the contents. So we can introduce that a little bit if you find that you're constantly becoming distracted. So let's do that practice now. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. As always, we begin by preparing the body. So setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. A vigilant posture is to simply keep the back nice and straight. And then at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And preparing the mind. Setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. And now allowing your eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed, and blink as often as you need. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass. Without grasping to them, without becoming distracted. And if you find that you've got caught up in a thought and got carried away, the first thing to do is simply relax. Then release grasping onto that thought and very gently return to observing the mind. So relax, release, and return each time you become distracted. Simply keep coming back to the mind again and again, patiently and happily. And if you're finding that you're constantly getting caught up and getting swept away by your thoughts, you might like to experiment with labeling or noting. That is, give a name to the mental event, and that can help us to have some space from it. And just naming the event itself, not the contents. And if you're finding that you're simply falling into dullness or laxity or drowsiness, then elevate the gaze and sharpen your focus, paying closer attention to the mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's begin with a short review of some of the points from Monday. So this is the practice we're doing is a shamatha practice. So what is shamatha? Shamatha is a Sanskrit term. Shama means calm, a non-discursive mind, and ta means to remain or abide. So shamatha is often translated as calm abiding. It's a mind that's not only calm, but abiding single-pointedly on an object. So shamatha is the practice of cultivating a calm, clear, and focused mind. In other words, it's a concentration, or in Sanskrit, samadhi practice. Why is this practice important? We saw there that in terms of everyday life, this practice is about improving our attention skills. And with that, then we'll be much more effective in everything we do in our life, much better mental balance, less agitation and stress. Instead of being slaves of our mind, we'll become masters of our mind, and also often leads to a lot of physical health benefits and improved sleep as well. But here in a Buddhist perspective, it's really integral part of the pursuit of genuine happiness. That in all Buddhist traditions, we have three core elements in the pursuit of genuine happiness. We have ethics, concentration, and wisdom, or in other words, vipassana practice. So on the basis of ethics, we engage in this shamatha practice, concentration practice, and that establishes the basis for the wisdom or vipassana practice. And here we have a quote from Attention Revolution, which says, mental balance is the gateway to finding genuine happiness, and shamatha is the key that opens that gate. So in that shamatha meditation, like all meditations, we begin by preparing body, speech, and mind, preparing the body, setting up a good posture, the speech, simply allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm, that'll start to calm the inner chit-chat, and then preparing the mind, allowing it to come to rest in a relaxed, still state in the present moment. And in the shamatha practice, we're cultivating three qualities of relaxation, stability, clarity. And we saw there the importance of first establishing a basis in relaxation. That without a relaxed body and mind, there's no way we're going to be able to cultivate any sort of sustainable stability and clarity of attention. So very much emphasizing initially relaxation. And then we looked at three other topics in terms of objects, tools, and faults. So the three objects that we're looking at were the breath, the mind, and awareness. And here we saw this quote from the great Indian Buddhist master Sangha from the 4th century. He says, if involuntary thoughts particularly dominate your behavior, then focus the mind in the mindfulness of exhalation and inhalation of the breath. And that probably accounts for most of us in the modern world. Many of us are really caught up in a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking. So for many of us, the breath is going to be the best object for shamatha practice. And that's why we spent that whole prior program working with the breath, these three variations of the breath practice, the full body, the abdomen, and the nostrils. But here in this program, we are looking at two other objects. The one we're looking at this week is the mind itself, meaning to observe the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. Many of you probably find that much more challenging than observing the breath, but as we're going to see, and as we saw last session, enormous benefits with this practice. Similarly, the practice that we're going to do next week, that is turning awareness in upon itself and just knowing that we're aware, resting in awareness, also has enormous benefits for us in the modern world. And we'll look at that practice next week. And then the following week, we're going to combine those two practices in a practice that I call stillness in motion. Also, there are other objects mentioned that we can focus on in the shamatha practice. Sometimes in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, often it's recommended to use a mental image of a Buddha to focus on. But as probably many of you found out if you've tried to do that, not easy. It's a complex visualization. Many of us are not very good at visualizing. and it's not something we're too familiar with. And then even sometimes in the text it says that, if you find that even focusing on the breath impossible or very difficult, you can even start with a sense object, a visual object such as a stick and a pebble, and look at that as a visual object. But that's something would only help us to get into the practice a little bit, and then we'd need to move on to a more subtle object such as the breath, or observing the mind, or another object such as that. And so with regard to this observing thoughts, we base that on this quote from this great 19th century Dzogchen master, Dudjom Lingpa, who says, "Some cannot calm their thoughts because the mind is so agitated. Such people should relax and let thoughts be as they are, continually observing them with mindfulness and introspection." So again, here, often when we see the word thought in a Buddhist text that's translating from Tibetan Buddhism, it's coming from a Tibetan term, namdok, which actually just means conceptual activity. So here, to observe thoughts means to simply observe conceptual activity. So it includes thinking, emotions, memories, and mental images. In the mindfulness of breathing, then of course thoughts were distractions, we had to let go of them, but here we're observing them. So let them be, simply observe them as they arise and pass, meaning not following thoughts, not trying to suppress them, not trying to make the mind still. But you may ask, well, what's the difference between observing thoughts and mindfully thinking? So this shamatha practice is not a practice of mindfully thinking. Mindfully thinking during the day is a very good thing to do, better than mindless thinking. But here we're not mindfully thinking. So what's the difference between mindfully thinking and observing thoughts? If we're mindfully thinking, then we are focusing on the content of the thought. For example, if we're thinking about a tree, what are we focusing on? The tree. If we're observing a thought about the tree, what are we focusing on? The thought. So that's the difference. This practice is simply observing the mental event itself, not allowing ourselves to get caught up in the contents of the mental event. And again, some of the enormous advantages with this practice, shamatha practice of observing thoughts, is that it really will help us to become the masters of our own mind. Many of us in the modern world are the slaves of our own mind. We're often tormented and overwhelmed by our thoughts, emotions, and memories. And since we're overwhelmed by them and we don't know how to deal with them, we try to simply suppress them. And that just leads to a whole lot of other psychological and physical problems as well. But if we can do this practice, then if we observe thoughts, then they have no power to harm us whatsoever. They only have power to harm us if we give them power, either by identifying with them and getting caught up in them, or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. And this is a topic I'll look at a little bit later in this session as well. Also, this is very much a healing, this very much helps to heal the mind, this practice, because a lot of psychological problems are through suppressing thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth. And simply by not suppressing them, allowing them to arise, to acknowledge them, allows them to release themselves. And this can be very much a healing practice. And also healing the body, because a lot of physical illnesses in the modern world are suppressed psychological disturbances in the mind. So that can really also help to heal the body. And also by observing the mind, it's very much a bridge into Vipassana practice. We may even come to an intuitive insight into the nature of our mind simply by observing the mind. So this practice is very much well known as a bridge into Vipassana or wisdom practice. So as we can see, there are enormous benefits with this practice, even though we may find it challenging initially. And then we saw that when we start this practice, there are two very common experiences we have. The most common probably is that we try to observe our thoughts and we simply get caught up in thoughts, that we keep getting swept away. So if we're getting caught up in thoughts and getting carried away, then as with all shamatha practices, first thing to do is to relax, then to release grasping onto that thought and simply return to the object, in this case, the mind. But then we talked about 3 short-term strategies that we can introduce into this practice if we're finding that we're constantly getting caught up and swept away. The one we mentioned in the meditation just now was labeling or noting thoughts, because if we give a name to the mental event, it becomes an object. We have some space from it. So you may find that helpful to do that. Another one we're going to introduce in the next meditation is anchoring in the breath. Again, if you're getting swept up and getting caught up and swept away by the thoughts, then go back into the body and focus on the breath. Have that as your main object, and then a little bit in the corner of the mind, notice your thoughts. In that way, we can anchor ourselves and not so easily get caught up in the thoughts. Or the one that we introduced in Monday's session is that if we simply can't watch thoughts at all, we get disheartened, then deliberately generate thoughts every now and again, because then we know it's coming. We can watch it arise and pass. So that can give us a little bit of feeling of success. But all 3 of these are not part of the standard practice. They are only simply temporary short-term strategies that we could use initially to help us to get into the practice. Eventually, we'll need to let go of all of those methods and just simply watch the mind. Another common experience when we start this practice is suddenly there are no thoughts. And one of the most common reasons for that is simply our focus is too intense. We're too intense focus and we're suffocating the mind. So if you notice you have intense focus, then relax the focus. Another reason there may be no thoughts is that we're getting very dull. So there may be thoughts there, we just don't notice them because we're so dull. So if we're noticing we're sinking, then sharpen the focus. Or another often common, we have a lot of thoughts like, there's no thoughts there, what's going on? I normally have a lot of thoughts, but now in this case, nothing's happening. I think I'm doing it wrong. I don't know what I'm doing. So this is all thoughts, this is all conceptual activity. So just observe those. And if there really is no thoughts there, then simply observe that empty space and wait to see what comes up next in that space, maintaining a continuity of attention. So that's some of the, a little bit of a review of some of the points from the earlier session. So the first topic in this session is stages of progress in shamatha practice. So we saw in the earlier program where we did the mindfulness of breathing, the classic model to describe the stages of progress in shamatha is this 9-stage model. We use this color diagram here that we can see, and we looked at these 9 stages in some detail in that program. And so here this quote says that shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages, relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. This is accomplished through the 6 powers and the 4 mental engagements. So we saw that we go through these 9 stages, beginning with directed attention up to attentional balance. And we do that through these 6 powers. The first power is hearing. First, we hear some instructions about this practice, and we put those instructions into practice. And that enables us to get to the first stage. And then to think about the practice a little bit more deeply, get more enthusiastic, that'll help us to go a little bit further to the second stage. And then as we're improving our mindfulness, we're getting better and better able to hold, to focus on the object. That enables us to go into stages 3 and 4. And then over those middling stages, then our introspection, our quality control gets better, picking up more and more finer degrees of agitation, excitation, and dullness. And that enables us to go through stages 5 and 6. And then even more enthusiasm for the practice enables us to really get to the higher stages, stage 7 and 8, where our mind now becomes completely still and quiet. And then through familiarity, we get to stage 9. And then we had those 4 types of mental engagements that we saw at the first 2 stages. We're just mainly off the object, we're mainly distracted. So we need to keep focusing our mind on the object. That's what focused engagement means. And then from stages 3 to 7, we're mainly on the object, and occasionally we get agitated, distracted, or a little bit dull. And then our focus, our engagement is interrupted by those various levels of laxity and excitation. And then finally, when we reach stage 8, we have flawless concentration, so uninterrupted engagement. And then that whole process becomes completely effortless at the 9th stage. And then we saw in this diagram right at the top in the middle is describing shamatha. The person flying through the sky was his physical pliancy, and the meditator riding the elephant to the mind, the mental pliancy. We can direct our mind to whatever we want without any resistance. And so then on the basis of shamatha, we can engage in the wisdom or vipassana practice. And that's the last diagram on the top right. We saw there that the meditator with the sword of wisdom in their hand, and they use that sword of wisdom in vipassana practice to cut through ignorance, mental afflictions, and suffering, achieving that genuine happiness. So this is the standard model that's used, particularly when we're using an object such as the breath. Here, in this practice observing the mind, then often a different model is used to describe the stages of progress in the practice. It's a 4-stage model that we see here in this slide. And the difference in these two models is a little bit the difference of perspective in the practice. And that comes down to, we see that actually a little bit in the 2 halves of the word shamatha. Shama means calm. So calm is talking about the event perspective. How are the events unfolding in the practice? And ta means to remain or abide. And that is the mind perspective, the mind abiding better and better on the object. And so that's really the perspective we have in mindfulness of breathing, that we go through these 9 stages, which are called the 9 mental abidings, where we're abiding better and better on the object as we move higher across these stages. Whereas in this practice, it's a little bit more like the event perspective. How are the events unfolding in the mind when we're observing the mind? And at the first stage of progress in this practice, what we notice is that there's just one thought after the other, a waterfall of thoughts crashing down on our mind. So that's the first stage of progress. That's what we notice. It's like a cascading waterfall of thoughts, non-stop mental events. And then if we keep watching those mental events, not getting caught up, not feeding them, then the amount of mental events will slow down a little bit. So at the second stage of progress in this practice, it'll be more like a river quickly flowing through a gorge, a fast flowing river of mental events. Still quite a lot of mental events and thoughts, but not as intense and fast as before. And if we keep watching those, then and we're not feeding them, then the amount of mental events will slow down even more. We'll start to notice bigger and bigger gaps between when one thought stops and the next thought starts. So we'll have more periods of stillness where there's not much happening. So at the third stage, it's more like a slow moving river of thoughts. It's slowing down a lot more gaps between thoughts. And then if we keep watching those thoughts, then eventually the mind becomes very quiet and still. And that's like that slow moving river emptying into a still lake or an ocean. So these are the 4 stages that are the 4-stage model that's quite commonly used with this practice to describe the stages of progress in this practice. And we have some correlations between this 4-stage model and the 9-stage model we looked at in the previous program, that the waterfall of thoughts is roughly equivalent to the first 3 stages of the 9-stage model, the fast-flowing river, stages 4 and 5 roughly, slow-moving river 6 and 7. And we saw in that 9-stage model that at stage 8, the mind became completely still. There was no agitation, dullness, or distraction. So that's here, stage 8 and 9 are then equating to the 4th stage of this model, the ocean unmoved by waves. And then this also describes the quality of the experience as we go through these 4 stages, that what we notice initially, a lot of movement in the mind at the first stage. Once we get to the second stage, then we really have a sense of achievement that we're really getting into this practice and we're really getting somewhere. And that continues into the third stage. And then also the quality of experiences, we become very familiar with observing the thoughts. And then in the fourth stage, then the quality of our experience is our mind becomes completely still. And then the last stage of that is it's said to be a mind of perfection. So this is the 4-stage model that is most commonly used with this practice. But also we can talk about stages of progress in this practice in terms of simply our ability to observe thoughts, not to get caught up in them, and just observing thoughts as thoughts. And so for this, we have another quote from, again, Dudjom Limpa, from Dzogchen master from 19th century. He says, by just letting thoughts be without having to do anything with them, all appearances lose their capacity to harm. So now what happens, of course, is when something unpleasant comes up, an unpleasant thought, an unpleasant emotion, unpleasant memory comes up, we don't know what to do with them. So we have a lot to do with them. In fact, we try and suppress them. And or either we get caught up in them or we try and suppress them. And in both of those occasions, we're feeding them, we're giving them a lot of power to harm us. So if we are grasping onto thoughts, emotions, memories, images, if we're grasping onto them, identifying them in terms of either getting caught up and following them or trying to suppress them, then we're giving power to them for them to harm us. Because if we look at what a thought, emotion, memory, and so forth is from its own side, they have no power to harm us whatsoever. So if we can simply release that grasping, release that identification with them, and just do as Dudjom Limpa recommends, just let them be, then they lose their capacity to harm, because their capacity to harm, we gave the capacity to them to harm us. So therefore, if we don't do that, if we just let them be, just observe them, then they can't harm us. And so we go through some stages of this release. Now it's hard for us to release grasping onto thoughts and emotions. We simply get caught up in them or try and suppress them. But what we in this practice, what we go through are these 3 stages of releasing the grasping onto thoughts. The first stage is naked release. And that is simply a thought or emotion or memory comes up, and then we start to grasp, but at some point we see that we see a thought, we recognize a thought as a thought or emotion as emotion. So therefore they're released simply by recognizing them, noticing, to seeing a thought, as emotion as an emotion, not identifying with them, not following them, not getting caught up. We see them nakedly. We see a thought as a thought. And that's what it means by naked release. So as soon as we see that, we're free of it, and then it will release itself. And then the thought or emotion is released. And then once we continue to do that, we become very familiar with that process. Then soon as a thought appears, we will recognize it as a thought. And so therefore we'll be able to release it immediately. Releasing means it doesn't mean get rid of it. It means no grasping to the thought. So appearance and release is when, through the power of familiarization with observing thoughts release themselves. And the analogy often given in the text here is like a snake unraveling itself. It simply releases, means it can't harm us. And then if we continue to do that and we become extremely familiar with them, then we get to the next stage, which is called self-release, which means we're now so familiar that we never grasp onto thoughts and emotions. We never identify with them. And so then it says that self-release is when there is no way thoughts can harm you, because we see thoughts as thoughts all the time. And the analogy is like a thief who comes to an empty house. There's nothing for the thief to steal. So these thoughts can't harm us because we are so familiar now with observing our thoughts. We never identify with them. We never grasp onto them. We never get caught up in them. And that is what's called self-release. So we will go through these stages as we go through this practice. Some tips for the practice before we go back to the practice. So here, some reflections on the practice. And again, I'd like to go back to Attention Revolution on page 101. And he says the following. In this practice, the locus of awareness gradually descends from the superficial level of coarse mental activity that is immediately accessible through introspection down into the inner recesses of the mind that are normally below the threshold of consciousness. You discover in this training that the border between conscious and unconscious mental events shifts in relation to the degrees of relaxation, stability, and clarity of attention. Especially when you engage in this practice for many hours each day, for days, weeks, or months at a time, you dredge the depths of your own psyche. In doing so, you remember long forgotten experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant, and a wide range of desires and emotions. So as we're observing and we're not suppressing, then what you will find is a lot of stuff will come up, and old memories and all sorts of things comes up. And then Alan Wallace goes on, he says, what happens here is a kind of luminously clear discerning, free association of thoughts, mental images, memories, desires, fantasies, and emotions. You are plumbing the depths of your own mind, undistracted by external diversions. Once hidden phenomena are unmasked through the lack of suppression of whatever comes up. This is potentially an extraordinarily deep kind of therapy, and the more intensively you practice it, the more important it is to proceed under the guidance of an experienced, compassionate teacher. During your meditation sessions, internalize the wisdom of this contemplative tradition and make sure that you implement the core instructions of this practice, which are, whatever arises in the mind, do not be carried away by it, and do not grasp onto or identify with it. Just let it be. Watch thoughts, feelings, or other mental events arise. With discerning intelligence, be aware of their nature and let them slip back into the space of awareness without any judgment or intervention on your part. This is the key to letting the knots of the psyche unravel themselves as the extraordinary healing capacity of the mind reveals itself. This is the path to deep sanity. So again, some short-term strategies that we mentioned earlier, and you can use these if you're finding it difficult to get into the practice. So again, if you find that you don't know where to look, or you can't really observe thoughts at all, then every now and again, deliberately generate a thought, because then you know it's coming. You can watch it as it arises and passes, and then you can get a bit of feeling of success. So that's one way to get into the practice a little bit. The second one, which we mentioned, was labeling or noting. Give a name to the mental event. If you give a name to it, you're free of it. It becomes an object. But again, naming the mental event, not the contents. So not, say, thinking about such and such, angry at such and such. Rather, thought, anger, memory, image, frustration, and so forth. And then also the one that you might like to experiment with in this meditation is anchoring in the breath. Maybe even you found with labeling or noting, you still got swept away. You didn't find that very helpful. Then go back into the body, focus on the breath. And you can focus on any of the variations of the breath practice, either nostrils, abdomen, rhythm of the breath, noticing the breath anywhere in the body, any of those variations. Start there, focus on that fully. Once you've established that basis, then a little bit in the corner of the mind, noticing the thoughts, but mainly focusing on the breath. And then after some time, you can shift to more focus on the thoughts and a little bit still in the corner of your mind, focusing on the breath, anchoring a bit on the breath, and then eventually letting go of the breath altogether. And so that way we can transition using the breath as an anchor into observing thoughts. So you might like to experiment with that if you find you're getting swept up in your thoughts all the time. And then the second point in terms of tips for the practice is the gaze. Remember let the gaze be vacant. So either naturally or partially open. And we saw there in the last session, there are at least 4 benefits for having the eyes open in this practice. One, it helps us to reduce the likelihood of laxity, improves clarity of attention, helps to lock us more into the present moment, also starts to break down this false sense of duality. With eyes closed, we have a strong sense of me in here, world out there. With eyes open, that starts to break down. And that's what we're coming to realize in Vipassana practice. So that's helpful then for later for Vipassana practice. And also to have the eyes open in this meditation helps us to transition into daily life. Because also in daily life, we want to be able to observe our thoughts and emotions without getting caught up in them. And generally in daily life, we have our eyes open. So if we've developed that ability to observe thoughts and emotions in meditation with eyes open, much easier to implement that in daily life. Now, for many people, our visual sense dominates, means it still remains active. So if you're having the eyes open, remember, we're not really looking at anything, but often then, because our visual sense dominates, we start looking around at all sorts of things. So therefore, a few tips. One is to have a softly lit room, maybe even a completely dark room. I like dark rooms for meditating with eyes open. Or have a blank wall in front of yourself. Don't have a lot of things for your visual gaze to attach onto. Or if you're in a place where you can't have that, then as a backup to that, and you find your eyes are moving all over the place, pick a spot in front of you and use that as an anchor. So we're not really looking at that, but it's better to look at one thing than the eyes moving around to all sorts of things. And then also we can use one of these contoured sleeping masks that allows the eyes to be open. It's completely dark. So that can be very helpful. And of course, be patient. We're developing a new habit. We're probably not used to meditating with eyes open. And as we saw there, also, if we're falling into dullness or laxity, elevate the gaze. That'll help to uplift the mind. And if we find agitation, excitation, distraction, lower the gaze. So you might like to play with the elevation of the gaze as well. So let's go to the actual practice now. So this practice that we're doing, the observing the thoughts practice, a number of analogies are used to describe this practice. Probably the most common one is that the mind is like the sky and the thoughts are like the clouds moving through the sky. Another analogy used in this practice is the mind is like an ocean, the thoughts are like waves on the ocean. Another analogy sometimes used is the mind is like a stage or a screen, and the thoughts are like the actors on the stage or the movie on the screen. So we have this sense of foreground and background. The background is the space of the mind, and the foreground is all the mental events that arise in that space. Now, the foreground, the mental events, come in really 2 flavors. There are what's called the more objective type mental events, the ones that are more discrete, things like thoughts, memories, mental images. And then there are the more subjective mental events, which are often more nebulous, and things like desires, emotions, mental afflictions, and so forth. And these subjective mental events are sort of closer to us. They're more sticky and they're often harder to notice. You know, we might be sitting there observing our mind and there's not much there, or we can't really observe it and we're getting very frustrated, but we don't notice the frustration because we're looking at the more objective mental events. So these subjective mental events often come in the form of reactions to objective mental events in terms of attachment to pleasant things, aversion, frustration, and so forth. And so what we're going, and then the space of the mind is the background, the space within which all these mental events arise, abide, and dissolve back into. So in this practice, what we're going to do is the same practice, but in this practice, paying particular emphasis onto the subjective mental events, things like desires, emotions, reactions, mental afflictions, because these are often harder to notice and we often miss them. So We're going to do the same practice, that is, observe the space of the mind and any mental events arising in that space, but paying particular attention to the subjective mental events, particularly any sorts of reactions such as craving, attachment, frustration, and so forth. Paying close attention to these so we don't miss them. The same instructions as before. Let your gaze be vacant, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, without distraction, without grasping. So here, have no preferences, not to have preference of preferring good thoughts over bad thoughts, or even having the preference of having no thoughts versus thoughts. In some ways, it's maybe better to have thoughts in this practice than the mind be still. Because if there's no thoughts in this practice coming up, then there's very much the danger we just slip into this very dull, spaced out state of mind. Whereas if there's thoughts coming up all the time, that challenges us to observe that. So, but to have no preference. If there's thoughts there, that's good. If there's no thoughts there, that's also good. If there's nice thoughts there, that's good. If there's not so nice thoughts, that's also good. It's all good. Whatever's there, it's all good, equally good. And again, to excitation laxity, again, you might like to experiment with a little bit the changing the level of your gaze if you're getting agitated or falling into dullness. And in this practice now, if you find that you're constantly becoming distracted, you might like to this time experiment with anchoring in the breath. Again, using any of the variations of the breath practice, any one you prefer. The full body, just noticing sensations anywhere in the body, the abdomen, the nostrils, the rhythm of the breath. Use that as an anchor. And then just a little bit in the corner of the mind, noticing thoughts. So that's the practice we're going to do now. So let's do that practice. So finding a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. As always, we begin by preparing the body. So keeping the back nice and straight. And allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. Mouth and jaw soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed. And relaxing more deeply with each out breath. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in stillness. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open. Resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And now bring your attention to your own mind. And observe the space of the mind and whatever is arising in that space. Without following thoughts, without trying to get rid of thoughts. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness, observing thoughts, emotions, and other mental events as they arise and pass. And in this session, paying particular attention to the subjective mental events, any emotions that are arising, any mental afflictions, especially any reactions to anything pleasant or unpleasant that is arising. And if you're finding that you're constantly getting caught up and swept away, constantly distracted, then you might like to experiment with anchoring in the breath. Have the breath as your main object of focus. And then just a little bit in the corner of the mind, observe your thoughts and emotions. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Time for some question answer now. So got any questions there, Miffy?
Yes, there are a couple of questions. So right at the beginning, I was thinking of when you were with the review saying when we're focusing the mind too tight and kind of suffocating it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like writer's block? Is that what happens in writer's block?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably not exactly the same, but it's similar in that with that, I think we're too much caught up. Well, often there's a lot of anxiety or fear or something, but basically we're caught up in the conceptual mind, and all these good ideas and intuitions and so forth is coming from a deeper level of the mind. So as long as we're sort of caught up in that sort of activity, that's sort of suffocating creativity and all sorts of things coming up. Whereas here, it's sort of like that, but it's this intensity of focus, because our habit, generally in our modern life, we have a lot of stimulus. Our minds tend to be quite chaotic. And so therefore, generally, whenever we focus on something in our life, we tend to sort of really do that quite intensely, because we think we're going to get distracted. And so we tend to bring that into this practice. And so we intensely focus. So we're taking up all the bandwidth of our mind in that intense focus. And so there's no really bandwidth left for things to come up. So it's not exactly the same, but similar to what you were describing there, I think.
Oh, okay. And then I found in the, particularly the first meditation, I experienced like a constant low-lying delirium, of just activity kind of, and I'm just wondering, is that like Jungian psychology explains there all the time in our unconscious, or is it more that the tone of our mind is changing in meditation?
Yeah. So I think in Alan Wallace's quote there, we talked about this threshold, using psychology terminology, we talk about conscious and then unconscious or subconscious. And if we haven't trained our mind, trained our attention, then generally the threshold is very high, meaning that we only really notice the sort of superficial surface mental activity. And there's a lot of mental activity going on below that threshold of awareness that we don't notice. And that's not good, because for example, if some mental affliction's coming up, some anger or something's coming up, then there's a build-up, and it's coming from these deeper levels, and this anger is building up and up and up, and we don't notice that because our threshold is up here somewhere. And it's only when that anger pops above that threshold, oh, there's anger there. But by that time, anger is already quite strong, and it's already start to get control of our mind. And so therefore, in this shamatha practice, as Alan Wallace mentioned, is as our mind calms down, becomes more stable, more clear, that threshold dramatically goes down, which means that you'll be able to pick up much more subtle mental activity that you didn't notice before. And also you'll be able to, how that's going to help us in daily life, translate into helping in daily life, is that we'll be able to pick up the beginnings of particularly mental afflictions much earlier in the process, which means that we're still in control, and we notice that anger starting to arise much earlier, and we go, oh, hang on, and then we're still in control and we can do something with it then. So therefore, that'll be the case. And so we will notice a lot of this mental activity that we didn't, and sometimes it's a bit, because a lot of this early subtle mental activity is not well formed yet into discrete things, that it'll seem a little bit nebulous, but we'll start to notice that. We'll start to notice that subtle mental activity, which we didn't really notice before.
Then Robin has a associated question with this about, could you explain what you mean by the suppression of emotions and how this affects our mind? She heard another point of view that there's no such thing as true suppression. So how does that fit in?
I'm not sure what she means by true suppression, but suppression basically means trying to stop something coming up, like pushing it down, basically to the point where we disown it. And once we've disowned those, they could be memories, they could be emotions or whatever, then we're really in trouble. We don't, because then often, like for example, you know, if we have an anger issue, we don't know how to deal with anger, and we don't want to express it because we see that just creates a lot of suffering for ourselves and the people around us. But we don't know how to deal with that anger, to work with it, to diffuse it. What we tend to do is we suppress it. We actively suppress the anger, try and push it down. It doesn't go away. And what happens, of course, is it manifests in the body, and often is a lot of illness. So with suppressed anger, we may have a lot of tension in the neck. We may actually have stomach, digestion issues. We may have all sorts of things going on through that suppressed anger. And then because we notice that there's something going on in the body, but we've basically disowned it, what we do is yes, there's anger, but it's not me, it's them. They're the angry ones. So what we do is we project. We tend to then, because we've disowned it, because we don't like it, we don't want to be associated with it, we project it onto the people around us. And so that really just creates so much psychological and physical problems for us, and also for the people around us. And so in doing this practice, we are stopping that process of the suppression. And that's why, as Alan Wallace mentioned, is that if we do this practice, you know, quite a lot, you know, for not just, you know, if we're only doing 15-20 minutes a day, that's good. But if we're doing it like more in a retreat setting for days and weeks at a time, then what's going to happen is this suppression, which often is unconscious, we don't realize we're doing it because it's so automatic, we'll start to let that out, let go of that. And all of this stuff will start to come up. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we've been holding down there that we're not even really aware of. And so that's why he said that if we're doing that if we're dredging the depths of our psyche in an extensive way in a retreat setting, that's why he said it's important to come under the guidance of a compassionate, qualified teacher to help us to guide through that. Because if not, then what can happen is that it's a little bit too much for us to process. We don't know how to deal with that. It's like a letting off the pressure cooker sort of thing. So, I mean, it's stuff we need to process and acknowledge and release, but we need to do that in a controlled way under the guidance of a teacher. And then it really can be very transformative and very much healing the mind.
And Glenn, with that, I mean, even just doing some meditation each day, you still need quite a bit of courage, because this kind of thing happens anyway, even at not such an intensive level.
Right. But again, what we saw in that earlier slide, the stages of release, thoughts and emotions and memories from their own side have no power to harm us. None at all. Zero. They only have power to harm us if we give them power. And if we can understand that, then it's easier to be, we don't need that much courage. I mean, we need some courage, but then we understand that we can do it. Whereas if we think that there are these big, dark, heavy memories and thoughts and emotions there, powerful from their own side, that are going to attack us, then of course we'll be scared, and then we'll even push down more. And we're just in a vicious cycle of perpetuating the very things we want to deal with. Whereas if we understand that these things from their own side have no power at all, they only have power if we identify with them and follow them or try and suppress them. And so if we can at least understand that, then we can have a lot of courage, because we can understand that, well, actually, I can do this. I can develop this capacity to, as Dudjom Lingpa says, that if we just simply let thoughts be and just watch them, then the capacity for them to harm us will vanish. They'll vanish. And so therefore, if we do this practice, and of course, initially we'll get caught up because that's our habit. I mean, we've developed the habit of getting caught up and suppressing for our whole life, basically. So to think that from one day to the next, we can sit back and watch and release everything, that's a bit unrealistic. But if we just continually do this, then we'll develop that capacity to be able to release, to let go better and better. And then we'll go through from that naked release, appearance and release, to self-release, that we'll get to the point where these things won't be able to harm us, because we're so familiar with we're so familiar with thoughts being thoughts, where we stop that grasping onto them, and then they really can't harm us at all. Which means that as we're dredging the psyche, and what we saw in the last program, that particularly those middling stages, we really start dredging up a lot of stuff. But by stage 6, we're really having this ability to observe things and not get caught up in them. So even though a lot of stuff's coming up, we're going to be able to have that ability, much better than now, of simply observing all of that stuff come up, and we'll be able to release it. And really will be a healing practice.
Yep, that's great. That really seems like the key. Then a couple of quick questions kind of associated with the environment of meditation. So Robin asked, if your altar's, quite Tibetan style and quite busy, is it better to go sit somewhere plain?
For this practice?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, hang on a second. I use this. If you really have that, I mean, what you could do is switch the lights off and be dark, but I use one of these. It's like a contoured face mask, sleeping mask. So it's 3 contoured. So, you can have your eyes open. You just put this on and you can sit in front of any Tibetan altar you like, and it'll be completely dark.
And then Ian had the opposite problem. I found it quite hard to focus on just the plain wall, because his mind wandered more with the blank canvas, then more stories came.
Good. And more stories, more things to look at. So remember, in this practice is not about trying to make the mind still. If you have a lot of thoughts, great. If you have a few thoughts, great. It's all great. So it's not like, oh, I can't do the practice because I've got a lot of thoughts. That's the wrong thinking. Then we have preference. Then we have a preference for stillness over movement. Then we have grasping, and then we're not going to go anywhere in the practice. So as we saw, the first stage of this progress is generally a waterfall of thoughts, a lot of thoughts coming. That's just normal, and that's fine. So the fact that there's a lot of thoughts there, that's no problem at all.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's it for the questions.
Okay. Oh, we've run out of time. So let's just finish with a dedication. So I'll just share this screen again. So we'll use the Shantideva dedication as we did last time. We'll do that at each session. So let's just dedicate all the efforts we've gathered today through this session using the Shantideva dedication prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. So next session, next week, we'll go to the second of the two practices here, the resting in awareness practice. So same time next week. So we'll do resting in awareness. And then on the Friday, a variation of that where we'll add a little bit of Vipassana to it. So sort of a more nature of mind practice, but essentially the same practice. And so that's what we'll be doing in the two sessions next week. So until Monday, have a nice weekend, and we'll see you back on Monday evening. So